faced by issues, relations with China, the viability of these very expensive purchases over the years ahead, and whether Australian strategic sovereignty is achieved through the AUKUS arrangements. We're following the traditional debate format, 3 speakers for the affirmative case, 3 for the negative. And without further ado, we'll launch into the first speaker. The first speaker for the affirmative side is Isobel Logan, 4th-year student of Bachelor of Arts and Advanced Studies at the University of Sydney in Politics, International Relations and Economics. Over to you, Isobel.
Good evening, Adjudicator, members of the opposing team and members of the audience. This evening we are here to discuss whether the AUKUS partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States is in Australia's national interest. On the affirmative team, we see that the capability, predictability and stability of this agreement allows Australia to pursue its national interests into the future. We define national interests as what is best for a sovereign state as a whole, including its goals and ambitions, be that economic, military, cultural or otherwise. This evening I will begin by outlining why the AUKUS Pact is essential in preserving the stable and predictable status quo that protects Australia's sovereignty and a key national interest. My second point demonstrates the unique advantages of both pillars of AUKUS in ensuring Australia's future capability and security. My second speaker will first argue how AUKUS provides Australia a geostrategic autonomy and the ability to be a leader in the Asia-Pacific region. Her second point will explore the economic advantages of AUKUS that bolster our national interest. My team's third speaker will summarise our case. Now onto my substantive. AUKUS is an investment into protecting Australia's security and sovereignty through interdependence that preserves the stable and predictable status quo. This fundamentally allows Australia to pursue its national interest. Today, the world is uncertain. The Defence Minister has said that Australia's strategic circumstances are the most complex and challenging they have been since the end of World War II. The international rules-based order is under threat, and we have seen this with the war between Russia and Ukraine, and in the Asia-Pacific with a more assertive China. Examples extend beyond the South China Sea conflict to direct threats towards Australia's national interests and security in the imposition of economic sanctions and attempts by China to establish a military presence in the Pacific. The peace and stability that Australia has come to take for granted is vulnerable, as the threat of armed conflict is less remote. Importantly, as a new feature of the international order, foreign interference and soft conflict with both government and non-government actors is more prevalent than ever. This is relevant for everyday Australians who have been subject to privacy breaches of their information, including the recent Optus and Medibank hacks. In fact, the government have recognised that foreign interference and espionage is the principal security concern for Australia. This change in global circumstances matters to Australia's national interest because of 2 fundamental facts. Firstly, the US-led rules-based international order provides Australia with security, free and open trade, and regional stability. These are critical enablers for Australia's peace, prosperity, and ability to further its own sovereign interests, be that trade, economic, and our social and cultural freedoms. AUKUS has a balancing effect by preserving the US rules in the Asia-Pacific and restricting the proliferation of China's hierarchy-based order, which privileges states based on size and power, and therefore would put Australia at risk. Secondly, since Australia is a small sovereign country, it will never have the capacity to unilaterally protect itself or further its own security interests or balance the threat of larger powers. Thus, Australia relies on allied relationships, which for more than 80 years have been the US and the UK, with whom we have ideological solidarity. AUKUS provide Australia with the future capability that it could not enjoy through any other partnership, nor acquire itself. It expands our strategic options by enabling Australia to act in its sovereign interests free from coercion to shape its own future. Under AUKUS, the Australian government maintain independent decision-making rights and have no reciprocal requirements. Maintaining and strengthening these 2 facts as the status quo is entirely within Australia's national interest. Thus, in essence, AUKUS is existential. My second point is the inherent necessity of both pillars in the AUKUS agreement to deliver on the aforementioned security, sovereignty, stability, and predictability. The first pillar of AUKUS relates to the provision of nuclear-powered but conventionally armed submarines and relevant naval training. These submarines are a critical element of Australia's hard security defence as an island nation. It has the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world, and therefore, in a best-case scenario, the submarines are essential for surveillance, reconnaissance, and as a deterrence mechanism to balance threats to Australia. In a medium-case scenario, these submarines can investigate and protect sea lanes and trade routes. Only in a worst-case scenario would they be involved in active conflict. Moreover, Australia's existing diesel-electric conventional submarine fleet will not be competitive from the 2030s. Nuclear-powered boats have a distinct advantage because they can travel further, faster, and have longer range strikes. The addition of the UK Astute and the US Virginia-class submarines, as well as the development of the SSN AUKUS submarine, which combines UK design and US technology, will give Australia immediate access to competitive, world-class technology. In addition, the agreement upholds Australia's passionate commitment to nuclear non-proliferation, as the technology in the submarines is not weaponisable on Australian soil. This has garnered support from the International Atomic Energy Agency as commendable as a model of transparency in nuclear non-proliferation. Equally, and if not more important, is Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which involves advanced military capabilities, including but not limited to quantum computing projects, artificial intelligence, and other technological and information sharing rights. Grey zone and cyber warfare is the greatest threat to Australia's national interest because it can weaken our system of government, social cohesion, and economic prosperity. Unlike conventional warfare, these types of threats have low barriers to entry once the enemy has the technology, making their use increasingly more likely in modern conflict. According to experts, having secure communications and the ability to decrypt those of the communications of our adversaries is a massive first mover advantage. The combined expertise, resource, and technology sharing in the AUKUS Pact enables Australia to more efficiently and effectively develop the essential capabilities required to remain competitive and balance the threat of foreign interference on defence, industry, and academia. The agreement spurs defence innovation, streamlines procurement, deepens interoperability, and strengthens industrial bases, overcoming the bureaucratic hurdles and knowledge gaps that would otherwise exist in a cost-effective manner. Australia has the potential but lacks the coordination in industry and distinct AI expertise. Therefore, the transfer of knowledge provided by AUKUS is the only way for Australia to patch up its security vulnerabilities before malicious actors can exploit them. Ultimately, it is important that the Commonwealth Government own these submarines and advanced technological capabilities, as well as have personnel trained, as is the terms of the AUKUS agreement, because Australia maintains full independent decision-making rights over when and how to use these assets. This is the scenario with which Australia's national security, sovereignty, and thus its interests are best enhanced. We agree that AUKUS is an immense and ambitious task. However, this does not diminish the critical nature of the agreement to Australia's national interest in ensuring sovereignty and future capability. If we compromise on what AUKUS provides us strategically, then the rest of Australia is compromised. Therefore, we are proud to affirm.
Thank you, Isobel. The first speaker for the negative argument is Roisin Browne, a 4th-year student at the University of Sydney, studying for a Bachelor of Arts, Advanced Studies in Politics, International Relations and French. Over to Roisin.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Roisin Browne. I'm the first speaker for the negative team. We've heard from the opposition that AUKUS is a beneficial strategic endeavour for Australia because it advances our military capabilities and balances against the rising threat of China. Tonight, our side recognises such benefits, and we agree that it is in Australia's interest to invest in its defence capabilities. However, We argue that the immense costs and risk of AUKUS outweigh its proposed advantages, and therefore this specific deal is not in Australia's national interest. In doing so, I will firstly address the benefits presented by the opposition and indicate how they are outweighed by the potential costs and risks associated with AUKUS. Secondly, I will outline the tremendous costs that this project will impose on Australia's economy and government. Then I will present the two most critical risks that AUKUS poses to Australia's national interests: the risk of damaging our existing relationship with China, and the harm it's caused to our relationships and reputation across the international arena, namely with France and other regional partners with whom we are aiming to establish closer relations. Following this, our second speaker will outline the long-term risk that AUKUS poses to Australia's national security, including threats to sovereignty, potential attacks from China, and the prospect of fueling an arms race in the region. Finally, our third speaker will build on this in order to conclude that Australia stands to lose far more than it could possibly gain from this agreement due to the high level of risk involved. So firstly, I'd like to touch on some points made by the opposition. She spoke of the US-led rules-based order, which apparently is pinnacle to enhancing regional security in the Indo-Pacific. We must recognise that this is a US-led rules-based order. We must consider its effectiveness when applied to the Indo-Pacific, and we also must consider alternative strategies of enhancing such regional security that are not dominated by Anglo-Western powers. Moreover, the first speaker spoke about our need to rely on partnerships with others, and that we cannot unilaterally protect our own sovereignty. We agree with this notion, but we implore the audience to think about the partnerships that it could facilitate within the region. And these are more important, arguably, to the Indo-Pacific security than partnerships with the US and UK, who do not stand as much to lose as we do from this partnership. This first speaker also talked about the immediate access that we'll gain to this technology, which is factually incorrect. The submarines that we're going to acquire from this deal will not come for another 20 years, and we have to consider what China would do in this time. AUKUS is not the only way of patching our security vulnerabilities, and arguably it makes us more vulnerable and it poses more risk to our national security than other strategies that could have been considered. So now I will delve into the considerable costs that Australia will be required to undertake for the AUKUS deal, offering insight into the gravity of this endeavour. The federal government estimates that the submarine program will cost up to $368 billion over the next 30 years. And with the Defence's abysmal record of delivering projects on time and on budget, we can infer that this number is likely to grow. This figure is technically achievable for Australia's budget, but not without diverting much needed resources from health, education and housing. Moreover, Australia's Defence Force will undoubtedly have to be restructured to satisfy this, narrowing its focus on developing maritime capabilities and pulling back efforts on other things that are core to our military. As a consequence, we must consider the risk that we will have a less capable and less ready Air Force and Army in the coming decades. This is fine if the government believes it can accurately predict exactly how future threats to Australia's security will manifest, but this is a big if. And the so-called largest threat to our security, China, is capable in every domain, not just underwater. We are putting a lot of our security eggs into one basket for weapons that we cannot even say for certain will be undetectable by technology by the 2040s. So now I move on to the risks. The first and perhaps most pressing risk that the AUKUS deal poses to Australia's national interests is the damage to our relationship with China. The announcement of the AUKUS partnership has agitated Beijing, with Chinese officials warning Australia that this is the wrong and a dangerous path for Australia's geopolitical self-interest. Australia's relationship with China is of the utmost importance to achieving its national interests, with the regional power being by far Australia's greatest two-way trading partner, accounting for almost 1/3 of our international trade. Conversely, Australia is China's 5th biggest source of imports and 10th largest export market. And so we can deduce from this that this relationship is of far greater importance for us than it is to them. Now we must consider the very real risk that China could use its trade relationships with Australia as a means to retaliate against AUKUS. It would be naive to assume that China will continue to finance our acquisition of these submarines by importing more and more Australian resources. Australia is no stranger to economic pressure by China, particularly since its recent experience of trade disruption and economic fallout caused by Chinese sanctions in the early years of the pandemic. We cannot overlook the possibility that the AUKUS deal could cause irreparable harm to Australia's most critical trade relationship, on which its economic prosperity largely depends. This possibility, paired with the significant financial burden that Australia is undertaking, puts us at an immensely vulnerable position, of which submarines cannot drag us out. The second fundamental risk pertains to the strain on Australia's diplomatic relationships with France and partners within the Indo-Pacific. Australia's scrapping of its deal with France in favour of AUKUS resulted in a serious diplomatic rift between the two states. This completely undermined trust and strategic partnerships between the two states and has damaged Australia's reputation as a reliable partner across the international arena. This fundamentally contradicts Australia's interest in strengthening its ties across Europe, which clearly underlines how the AUKUS decision conflicts with Australia's strategic objectives. Moreover, Australia's signing of the deal has behaved as a barrier to developing stronger ties with key partners in the Indo-Pacific. Malaysia has emphasised that identifying China as an enemy is a self-fulfilling prophecy for Australia, while Indonesia has criticised Australia's movement towards a nuclear fuel policy. Australia's disenchantment of these critical regional partners completely undermines its effort to further integrate into the Indo-Pacific and build meaningful regional partnerships to enhance security. Instead, it signals a move backwards towards a colonial vision of the region as dominated by Western powers who enjoy a military advantage over those who live there. I'll end with this. Our security efforts should be with Asia, not against it.
Thank you, Roisin. The second speaker for the negative case is Nadia Maunsell, a recent graduate.
Affirmative case.
The affirmative case, I'm so sorry, thank you.
That's all right.
Nadia Maunsell is a recent graduate of the University of New South Wales, where she majored in communications and journalism. Over to Nadia. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. As Ian stated, my name is Nadia. I'm the second speaker. And before I start my points with you all, I'd like to respond to some of the comments that the opposition made. Primarily the issue of cost. I think it's really important that we kind of consider the fact that what cost are we willing to put on national security? What cost would the opposition put forward as an accurate and quantifiable figure that we can say is appropriate for Australia's border defence and technological capabilities for the future? The second point that the opposition brought up was risks, primarily the risk of damaging Australia's trade relationship with China. Now, our team does agree with the opposition that the relationship with China is one of Australia's most important and most significant relationships. However, the opposition seem to have conflated Australia's security alliance with the US with our economic relationship with China. Just because Australia decides to have a very strong, historical, long-standing relationship with the United States that China is well aware of, does not mean that trade with China will be impacted in any way. We can look at the example of India and Pakistan as an example for that, where their security relationship is fraught, but the economic relationship is strong. So we'd also like to kind of add to that China has been well aware of the security relationship for a long time, and more importantly, it's not willing to compromise the strategic assets, specifically to do with natural resources, iron ore, that it gets from Australia. with these particular trade sanctions that we saw recently, as the opposition team mentioned, we can see that none of those sanctions were put on strategic sectors, such as iron ore. So we argue that that would not have any impact in the long term at all. China knows that it is too reliant on Australia. With regard to relationships in the Pacific and beyond, there is a knowledge, an understanding among our Pacific friends that Australia has very deep links with multilateral affiliations such as ASEAN. The economic links between Australia and its neighbours are deep and vast. Having a security alliance with the United States does not threaten that in any way. I'd now like to go into the points that I have prepared for today's debate. So, beginning first with the AUKUS Pact giving Australia the unique ability to demonstrate leadership in a time of crisis. My first speaker already highlighted how new technological capabilities delivered as part of the AUKUS Pact are essential for Australia's national security. To add to this, I will now argue that Australia has the opportunity to establish a foundation on which to build its reputation as a leader in our region. Rather than being led, the AUKUS Pact provides an opportunity for Australia to lead the United States and the United Kingdom. To do this is deeply in our national interest as a middle power in the Asia Pacific. Assuming a best case scenario, the United States remains the sole hegemon of a unipolar world, and the AUKUS Pact helps to preserve strategic balance and deterrence in our region. In this scenario, the AUKUS Pact is not a radically new change in Australia's foreign policy. It is simply an upgrade, an extension on the existing ANZUS Treaty with the United States signed in 1951. In a much more likely medium case scenario, we will see the emergence of a bipolar world where two superpowers, the United States and China, share the region but are unable to establish undisputed primacy. In this scenario, smaller countries such as Australia and others wield an asymmetric advantage. Australia can afford to make decisions that influence the United States, an opportunity that would simply have been unthinkable when ANZUS was signed in 1951. The AUKUS Pact is therefore an unlikely but crucial investment into the region for Australia's powerful allies. For example, to pick up the pace of emerging technology development and stay ahead of competitors in the region, the United States needs to invest in Australia as a friendly location for innovation and research and development. This gives Australia the opportunity to take more of an active role. For example, US-based military technology company Anduril recently expanded its operations to work with the Australian Defence Force through AUKUS, and that's only the beginning. AUKUS further strengthens the United Kingdom's Global Britain initiative, which will see massive future investments in strategic technology and infrastructure. Rather than depending on our powerful allies and foregoing Australia's national interests, the AUKUS Pact is an opportunity to rely on Australia's expertise and invest in our future national interests. Now onto my second argument. The AUKUS Pact will boost Australia's advanced manufacturing, technology, and education sectors, which are essential to securing Australia's national interests. Equally, the Pact will not significantly affect our key regional trade relationship with China, as I mentioned before. Artificial intelligence and quantum computing, by themselves or in tandem, are expected to revolutionize the manufacturing, pharmaceutical, and financial industries. Australia would be foolish to not try and capture some of the potential $22 trillion value creation in the world economy, coming primarily from the United States, which has made these investments into these technologies. 16,000 new jobs quantum innovation could provide to Australia's economy by 2040. Currently, Australia exports and imports the vast majority of goods with our major trading partner, China. At no point do we see this relationship changing. Due to the interdependence of our economies, high complementarity of trade, and our respective comparative advantages, this relationship will persist. Regional exports, interestingly, to the rest of Asia make up just under 40% of all of Australia's exports. So we have alternative markets should everything go tits up with China. Given Australia's economic reliance on primary industry, the AUKUS Pact can actually help to diversify Australia's offerings. It provides a pathway for Australia to be a great contributor to the technological developments that will define our future. Moreover, to train a workforce capable of operating the new military assets and technology transferred into Australia, higher education institutes will need to invest significant amounts of money into these sectors, and that's inclusive of civilian and military education. There are 8 Australian universities included as part of the top 200 universities in the world, and given the serious competition between developed economies over global talent, the AUKUS Pact will further mark Australia as a high-quality engineering and STEM education source. Moreover, the industrial sector stands to benefit from investments into workforces that can build and maintain these parts for the AUKUS Pact. Hence, the AUKUS Pact represents a significant source of economic activity that form an essential part of Australia's national interest. In addition to my first point, which was that Australia has a real role to play as a strategic leader in our region for the United States and the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. We now revert to the theme. The second speaker is Ella Whitehurst, a third-year Juris student at the University of New South Wales, with degrees already in Asian Studies and Languages from the AUKUS. Over to you, Ella.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ella, and I am the second speaker for the negative team tonight. My team's position tonight is not the government averse to the development and strengthening of our defence and defence technologies. Indeed, we acknowledge that it is vital to have a strong security emphasis, especially in a world where geopolitical and economic rivalries are becoming increasingly relevant. Instead, we are advocating that the benefits of the AUKUS deal are not worth the costs and risks that are involved in its undertaking. This analysis demonstrates that the AUKUS deal is not in the best interests of Australia. Before I move on to my substantive points, I will address some of the points made by the opposing second speaker tonight. Firstly, she addressed that and questioned our authority or our capability, perhaps, to determine what cost we would deem acceptable or suitable to spend on a defence alliance or deal with the same goals. To this, we would argue that we do not set out in our argument tonight to claim what is an acceptable amount to spend, or we do not try and claim that the money spent on the AUKUS deal is unacceptable. However, what we argue is that the costs could be employed somewhere else or to another deal that has less risks and is more likely to succeed with more benefits to Australia's best interests. Secondly, she argued that we are a leader of AUKUS, a deal that is a continuation of our foreign policy. To this, I would argue that we are not a leader in this deal, which I will also be going more into my substantive arguments. We are acquiring US subs in the 2030s, and then we will be developing UK design subs. We are not a leader, we are simply following the interests that these countries wish for us to do. And finally, in terms of economics, the claim that China will offer to will remain important to Australia, and that our supply of strategic mineral ores, for example, that they cannot achieve, they will maintain that trade relationship in order to access them. I argue that this relationship of trade is more a relationship of convenience due to geographical positioning, and is not one of friendship and trust and reliance. There are many countries that have iron ore, and I'm sure China will be able to source it elsewhere should they choose to. I will now move on to my substantive material. My teammate Roisin has outlined the costs and immediate risks involved with the undertaking of the AUKUS deal. I will add to these with my own arguments that the AUKUS deal comes with other long-term risks as well. First, I will argue that the interoperability benefits of the AUKUS
deal are not worth the costs and risks that are associated with sacrificing our national sovereignty and perhaps also our diplomatic and defence influence within the region. Secondly, I will outline the risks of Australia's acquisition of nuclear submarines through AUKUS, which could potentially facilitate further arms races or nuclear proliferation within the Asia region specifically. Now, onto my first argument, outlining why the restrictions to our national sovereignty imposed through AUKUS are not in Australia's best interests. First, I would definitely want to clarify that losing some sovereignty with defence alliances is an unavoidable aspect of strengthening defence ties with allies, and also does come with the benefits of personnel and technological interoperability. Rather, my team tonight argues that as it stands, AUKUS allows the US to fully incorporate Australia into its containment efforts against China. The offensive stance of the AUKUS deal can only further aggravate the already tense relationships between Australia and China. The US and China. In such a context, war over Taiwan is increasingly becoming a serious possibility, and now with AUKUS, it is a certainty that Australia will be expected to join with the submarines that the US will be selling us in 10 years' time. Inevitably, these subs, of which the US currently does not have enough of and is not producing any more to sell to us, will be under American control should such conflict arise. So yes, the AUKUS deal gives us these benefits of interoperability with the US and UK, who both have strong military forces. However, AUKUS is not just a defence alliance to Australia, it represents Australia's commitment that we will go to war against China with the US and the UK. And what the government might not have realised is that the US, however, cannot promise us that we will win such a conflict. The costs and risks involved for the US to maintain its power within the region are continuously growing with China's economic and political rise in the region. American policy is also continually developing an American first attitude. So ultimately, they can always walk away. They have done so when they are losing a conflict. It happened in 2021 with Afghanistan. Who's to say that it wouldn't happen here and now should such a conflict arise? But considering our geographical position within the region, AUKUS then leaves us in a very vulnerable position. The government appears to continuously ignore the trends of increased rivalry and tension as China grows. So the AUKUS deal and our promise to the US will limit Australia's ability to respond to these tensions as an independent nation due to the commitments it represents. For these regions, I argue that the surrender of our sovereignty through AUKUS is not in our best interests, as it comes with the opportunity cost for regional defence cooperation in the future. I will now move on to my second argument that AUKUS is not in Australia's best interests, as it could facilitate further proliferation within the region. Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister, describes AUKUS as a charm offensive that begins a new era of listening to the region, not dictating to it. And yet, Australia with AUKUS has now just set a risky precedent for future nuclear proliferation. With AUKUS, Australia has become the first non-nuclear weapon state to exercise a loophole to remove nuclear material from the current inspection systems. And this is a potential loophole that could be used with other would-be nuclear proliferators to exploit this in a way that to develop nuclear weapons under the guise of submarine development. This runs a risk of actually damaging regional peace and security, which is certainly not in Australia's best interests. That concludes my arguments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. It's now time for the Affirmative team to round off their case with their third speaker, Ryan Moore, a third-year student at the University of Sydney, studying for a Bachelor of Arts in Advanced Studies, History and English. Ryan.
Good evening. Tonight's debate seems to have centered around a handful of points of contention. The first is the strategic risks that AUKUS poses to Australia's relations with other countries. The negative team has brought up the examples of Australia's relationship with China, first and foremost, its relationship with the French, and its relationship with other Southeast Asian nations. We believe that the tensions caused, and we acknowledge that there have been tensions caused by AUKUS. We believe that these tensions haven't actually had and will not have a severe impact on Australia's economic or on Australia's economy or on its general strategy in the region. On the issue of Sino-Australian relations deteriorating and the possibility of China losing, or the possibility of Australia losing trade with the Chinese, we believe that Australia can't actually. We believe that we'd like to point out that there aren't many other sources of iron ore that China can look to, and even during the most tense periods between Australia and China's relationship, China has continued to trade with Australia because it needs its iron ore to build up the rest of its country that still remains underdeveloped. So there's this kind of economic interdependence between China and Australia. So even if tensions do rise and they do flare up, it's highly unlikely that China will impose a ban on the import of Australian iron ore or its natural resources, because they're essential for its development. On another issue that's emerged is this implicit question of what sovereignty looks like for small and large countries. The negative has come out and said that small nations in Southeast Asia are vulnerable to a form of neo-colonialism that's going to emerge as a result of the AUKUS partnership. Western nations can bully Southeast Asian nations into submission. But we'd like to point out that the AUKUS Pact doesn't actually place Australia and the US on some kind of war footing. It's actually a response to a pre-existing military build-up by China. China was the first mover. This is simply a proportionate response, a kind of tit-for-tat response that is a kind of insurance policy against the worst-case scenario, against a kind of worst-case scenario where China and the United States do come into some kind of a conflict in the region, which isn't likely anyways. On the issue of the economic risks of AUKUS, which is another key clash that's emerged in this debate. The negative is mentioned that the money spent on nuclear submarines could be better used in the health and education sector, and that the military capability that AUKUS deal provides to Australia, there's the possibility that it won't be adequate enough to meet China's military and cyber warfare firepower. And we've placed a lot of eggs in one basket in this deal. But we'd like to point out that the AUKUS deal isn't just about nuclear submarines. It's not just about military capability. it's as my team's second speaker mentioned, there are going to be immense economic benefits from the knowledge transfer that will take place between the US, the UK, and Australia. For instance, the artificial intelligence and quantum computing knowledge sharing agreements will potentially, and experts say that they will probably become multi-billion dollar industries. So the expertise that these the technological expertise that Australia will acquire through AUKUS will set Australia up for immense economic growth in the future when things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and quantum computing get to a more advanced stage. Just Australia will reap immense economic benefits, and it will probably outweigh whatever the cost of AUKUS is. So to summarize my team's case, my team's first speaker talked about increasing geopolitical tension, prompting Australia to take part in a US-led, rules-based international order, which would provide Australia with security and free and open trade and regional stability. She also mentioned that AUKUS acts as a kind of counterbalance to China's exploitative hierarchy-based order in the region, and how AUKUS is a pact that enables Australia to enter in a partnership with those with nations with similar values, this connects to my previous point about an implicit question of what sovereignty looks like for small and big countries. It's simply not realistic that Australia can take the lead in international affairs in a way that the United States or China do. It's a country of 22 million people, not 1.something billion and 320 million. Sovereignty will look different for a smaller nation than a larger nation, and the technology and the technology transfer that the AUKUS deal provides in the sort of artificial intelligence and quantum computing space, that also relates to military capability. So AUKUS also allows Australia greater independence in the battle spaces of the future. Thank you for listening.
And now to round off the entire debate, we have the third speaker for the negative. Bakar Mohamed is a third-year student in the social sciences and a prospective student for a Master of International Relations. Over to you, Bakar.
Good evening, esteemed guests, colleagues, and who we've collectively agreed to call, say, our adjudicator, Mr. Speaker. Now, I got the position of third speaker, which is basically the position you get left with when you're the last person to voice your preference. But I'd like to turn to some of the arguments that were made by the opposition. I think some solid arguments, except that it didn't address the core of the topic that we were speaking about, and I think some of this is what will come up. And I'd like to speak to some of the points that were made by Ryan, the third speaker, in his final comments. And that's the first, is about when he spoke about the strategic risks to regional partners and our relationship with China. And I'm not sure how well versed people are with the comments that have been coming out from the Foreign Minister of China, but comparing the AUKUS agreement to a NATO-based alliance in the Indo-Pacific seems like it's going to have a bit of influence. Seems like it's going to maybe play with the relationship that we have with China. And the same with Indonesia and Malaysia, both who voiced their anger and disappointment last year with the AUKUS agreement. So it will have implications for our relationship and with our trade with our regional partners. Secondly, iron ore and Australia dependence Sure, China needs our iron ore. Let's work with that as the premise. Australia depends on China for 36% of our trade. China relies on 3%. Tell me who has the leverage. Iron ore, you've got that argument. Almost everything else, they've got us in the bag. The third argument about sovereignty for small nations, and that the argument that against that the smaller nations are vulnerable to neo-colonialism, and that AUKUS is somehow a response to a military build-up by China. Now, I'd like to cite some statistics about where Australia sits in Southeast Asia, but also in the Indo-Pacific, and where its power lies. If you want to talk about a response to China, then we ought to consider strategy. Militarily, Australia ranks 7th in Asia. At a mere 36 points out of 100, China ranks 2nd, sitting at around 68 points out of 100. Now, when we look at diplomacy, however, Australia ranks 5th, and they've just upped themselves 2 positions. And they sit at around 40 points, whereas China sits at 3rd, but they sit at 60 points. So we have much more leverage using the tool of diplomacy than we do military. Secondly, according to the Logan Institute Asia Power Index, when they talk about defense alliances in the region, then Australia ranks 2nd. This ought to be the greatest tool that we can capitalize if we want to respond to the Chinese build-up of this military force that China is threatening. AUKUS is not an appropriate response. If we want to rebel against China, we ought to use diplomacy, and we ought to use regional defense alliances with states such as Indonesia, who's projected to be the 4th greatest economy in the world by the 2050s. With states like India, who's the competing state against China in the Indo-Pacific. For Australia to think that it can project its power and become this regional, this demagogue against the US, it's only fooling itself. And it's a mere extension of US interests. The fourth point that Ryan made against the idea that the money can be spent elsewhere, and that was one of the arguments that was raised by our speakers, and that how much would we pay for national security, and that this is not just a military trade, but it involves some involvement of our tech development and our education and the like. And to that I respond, sure. Definitely, we need to capitalize on building our education, on building our technology. But why through AUKUS? Why does AUKUS have to be the way that we develop this? Surely another alliance can establish it. Surely we can just invest in ourselves and develop the educational programs. We don't need to undertake a risky enterprise like AUKUS for Australia to wake up to itself and say, let's invest in some education surrounding nuclear technology. Okay. Now, I'd like to reframe AUKUS before I conclude with some summarizing sort of, the summary bit that we do for our speakers. And for those that aren't yet convinced that AUKUS is this thing that ties us to the US, this thing that ties our sovereignty, the affirmative side made the argument that Australia will maintain its independence. And Richard Marles constantly reiterates this notion that Australia will still have its sovereign capacity. And he dismisses any concern of breach of Australian sovereignty. And I'd like to take us back to the 1950s and 1960s, amidst the peak of the space war between the US and Russia, the Soviet Union. And amidst that peak, where you have the Soviet developing their space tech, and they finally reach space, and then you have the US trying to compete. And in the 1960s, the US establishes NASA, and the US increases NASA's budget in the late 1960s by 89% because they want to win the space race against the Soviet Union. And then of course the US ends up winning because cool. But let's paint a different picture. 1967, the US is preparing its Apollo mission to beat the Soviet Union as being the first to go to the moon. But then the US recognizes that France is also in this space race. So you know what? Let's give 3 of our rocket engines and up to 5 so that they can also, just as a trade, as an economic incentive to France. How would that look? Why would the US give away some of their critical resources amidst the peak of the Cold War, amidst the peak of this space race between them and the Soviet Union? Drawing back to this alliance of AUKUS, why would the US give so much of its submarines? Oh, thank you. Why would the US give so much of its critical resources, its submarines, at a time where China has superseded the US in its naval technology and it's predicted to supersede the US in its submarine development by the 2040s? Now, I'd like to reiterate the comments that were made by my colleagues, starting off with Ro, and the arguments against China and how it threatens our relationship, but also how it threatens our alliances with regional allies. And then to Ella, who spoke about the idea of this threat of nuclear proliferation, which Australia seems to champion against this idea of nuclear weapons, but we're clearly setting the path towards a door that shouldn't be opened. And in that we conclude that AUKUS comes with some great benefits, sure, but its risks outweigh the benefits. My final comment and thought for you to think about is, that's great, the only thing I relied on with my phone. The choice is one that will determine Australia's future in the region. Do we want to merely become an extension of the US-led front against China? Or do we want to take a step back, reassess our interest, and decide what's best for Australia? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bakar, and all six of you for very, very thoughtful, eloquent, and very interesting comments on this very complex topic. Greatly appreciated. We now have a few moments while our adjudicator prepares his judgments. Alex McManus is a counsellor and former intern here at the Institute in New South Wales. He holds a Juris Doctor and a Bachelor of Arts with first-class honours in Government and International Relations from the University of Sydney, and currently works at a leading Australian law firm. Alex debated in the finals of the Australian Intervarsity Debating Championships and has judged debating competitions around Australia, Asia and Europe. So he'll be laying down a few findings in just a moment, but before that I'd just like to give you a quick account of what's coming up in Institute activities over the weeks ahead. Following the Easter break, we're due to issue another edition of Columns from Glover Cottages, in which counsellors and interns recommend readings and movies and items of interest on international relations. The week after that, on the 18th of April, Susanna Patton, who is the director of the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute, will address us on the Lowy Power Index. Then on the 2nd of May, we're planning to host a book launch by a former trade union leader and a senior business figure here in Sydney, Dr. Michael Eason AM. He's written a book on Whitland's foreign policy. We look forward to that launch very much. So that's what's coming up over the weeks ahead. Do join us, whether online or here in Glover Cottages. But now it's time for the adjudication.
So if they time themselves, I'm going to try and keep the time limit myself. Okay. First of all, really like to congratulate both teams on what was a really outstanding debate from both sides of the aisle. So just before I kind of get into ruining one team's night, can we get a round of applause for both sides of the house? So ultimately, I think there was a few issues in this debate that I'm going to try and break down and explain why I thought that they fell the way they did. The first thing that I'm going to begin with is, although maybe not the kind of area that you would have thought the debate was most central to, became quite a big issue early on, which was around the economic benefits or harms that might come out of this very directly. So what we heard from the Affirmative was that there was particular benefits that Australia could get out of being involved in AUKUS. This was particularly things around the second pillar of AUKUS, so investments in quantum, investments in artificial intelligence, boost to the education system around Australia, and how that would be particularly useful. We heard a few kind of responses from the negative side. The first was to say that this had to be stacked up against potential negative impacts on things like hospitals and things like the general budget, which I think was somewhat convincing but wasn't particularly developed. But I think that then we really got to the point that we have to kind of weigh this against the effects that this might have on Australia's particular situation in terms of trade. And I think that where I want to park the economy for a second here is that I probably believe at the end of the debate that there is some benefit that comes out of being involved in AUKUS in terms of investment in our educational system, in terms of investment in our technology, and the way to capture that. I think then how you weigh that in the debate depends on what you think about the way that China would respond to this, and in terms of how much we think the trade retaliation might be important in this debate. So then we get on to the kind of the China retaliation part on the trade thing, which I think dominated a large part of the debate. What we hear from the negative is that you're going to be risking putting an enormous amount of Chinese imports and exports kind of on the line. And that is particularly that China is willing to kind of wield that power on us, and even if they haven't done it before, they might do in the future. What we hear from the affirmative is kind of two responses. The first is that this isn't kind of guaranteed that they're going to behave in this way, and the second is that historically China has not kind of behaved in this way. They've quarantined minerals from our our trade war. There's a certain level of complementarity. I think what I believe at the end of this is that I think that although China hasn't pulled the lever, I think that later in the negative team's case, we do get some explanations to kind of why they might be able to. We get that although iron ore is particularly valuable to China, there are still other sources of it, even if they're not in Australia. We also get that although that might be one particular area in which Australia has a lot of leverage, there are other areas in which China has an enormous amount of leverage and might be able to use those. So at the end of that, I think that it's quite likely that China is going to pull some sort of retaliation, even if it is not kind of as bad as the negative team initially wants to characterise. I think that there is a really severe risk that China does pull some sort of economic leverage on Australia, and that would be particularly detrimental. But now on to the last part of this, which was in terms of kind of security and how this would play out in terms of kind of raw power security. So we get kind of two things. The first is about alliances. The affirmative team out of that says that we need to be able to protect ourselves with alliances. We've got a problem in terms of geography. We're a large island nation. We need to be able to defend ourselves. We've always used allies to do that. The negative team's characterization of this is that we should have as many allies as possible in as many places as possible, and in particular we should have allies in Asia. They talk about the way that Indonesia and Malaysia has responded to this, and they talk about the way that China has responded to this. I think at the end of this, I'm not necessarily convinced that Australia's alliances are going to be with other parts of Asia, are going to be really destroyed by this. I think the negative team needed to do more work to show that that was likely going to be the case. But I think I am convinced that this is not going to necessarily lead to a situation where Australia is going to be able to really, really easily build alliances. So I think at this point, there might be some negative impact on alliances. I don't think it's probably as bad as negative want to claim. So I think that although that's important, it probably isn't decisive in the way that I see the debate. The last thing really is about kind of what happens if we get into kind of a full-scale war. And I think the framing that we get from the affirmative initially on this is quite useful. There's three kind of scenarios that play out in this debate. The first is there's kind of a unipolar world in which America is the sole kind of hegemon, which I think everyone in the debate agrees is unlikely to be the scenario going into the future. The second is that there is a bipolar world, and the third is where China is kind of the dominant power and there's some level of conflict. On the second, in terms of the bipolar world, I think we get an interesting argument from the affirmative, which is to say that in that situation, the US really needs Australia, and there's going to be some amount of leverage that Australia can pull from that, and that's important. But then I think on the worst case scenario, what we hear from the negative is that really, this is a situation in which America could kind of drag us into war. I think by the end of the debate, both sides are realistic that there's kind of some element of attachment and linkage to China that exists. I think the phrase that Ryan kind of uses at third neg is that sovereignty doesn't look the same necessarily for small island countries. or smaller countries, you do need to kind of at some point fall in line with larger players. I think at this stage, the risk, as is kind of alluded to, a second neg and then a third neg, is that America kind of pulls out entirely and kind of drags you into a war and then kind of leaves you high and dry, and that is a really dangerous situation for Australia to be in. I think at the end of that, I think this is a particularly close issue. I think that is a really significant harm in this debate, and that is a really significant negative implication that could happen, that there is a realistic possibility that Australia gets dragged into this and then America cannot finish the job and Australia ends up in a really detrimental impact, in a really detrimental situation in the long run. So, because of that worst case scenario, and because although I believe that there might be some economic gain, I don't know that it necessarily outweighs the impact of Chinese sanctions, and because although I don't think our alliances are going to be particularly damaged, there is some risk that they don't get any kind of better in Asia. I have awarded the debate tonight to the negative team, so congratulations.